I'm really looking forward to hearing a bunch of different opinions and having some lively debates and discussions.
I think I'm looking forward to how the limits of protest are viewed in this society as a whole.
I'm interested to learn about the different protests, but also the different opinions on when is it okay to protest.
I would like to know about the university stance on protesting and stuff like that, and how it can be done in a way that's not going to be harmful for you as a individual with your career and progress and stuff like that.
When do you think it's okay to break the rules?
Ooh.
As a French person, I say always, Respect your rights. Yeah, we have rights for a reason. Unfortunately, more recently we've been kind of losing them, and so we should fight for them, I think.
If there's injustice going on, if there's a severe situation like climate change, bearing down upon us, and people doing what appears to be very little to sort it, then I think that at that point, break as many rules as you want.
Hello, I'm Richard Whitman and welcome to Kent Talks. We're joined by world-leading researchers to discuss protest, strikes, terrorism and activism. From Just Stop Oil to rail strikes, when is resistance justified? Here with me today are members of the School of Politics and International Relations at the University of Kent, Dr Nadine Ansorg, head of the school, Dr Iain MacKenzie, reader in politics, who writes about the relationship between ideas and resistance, Dr Kuzi Zigomo, who's lecturer in international relations of the Global South and currently researching authoritarian regimes in Africa, and Dr Ben Turner, who's a senior lecturer in political theory with interests in the politics of technology and work. And we're joined by a fabulous audience of young people and some older people from across Kent, and we're really looking forward to hearing from them in a bit. So Iain, when's it okay to break the rules?
Let's start with something fairly obvious. There's hardly a democracy in the world that hasn't been forged out of rule breaking, and more often than not, violent rule breaking. This is certainly true of the United Kingdom. Our parliamentary democracy was born out of conflict. It was born out of rule breaking. And that rule breaking, of course, helped establish what we know today as our parliamentary democracy, and particularly, of course, the political system that enables rights, liberties, equalities, and so on to be, yes, refined, they're not perfect, yes, extended, we haven't reached the full extent of our equalities yet, but within that system that's been created. So I want to just kind of signal a couple of cautionary notes, if I may. We have a political system with a set of rules that allows us to change the laws, that allows us to go onto the streets to think about how we might shift and refine and change certain norms of behaviour, certain kind of cultural expectations. And yes, we have a parliamentary system that will enable us to make our democracy better. Sometimes bits of this system can get a little bit unbalanced, I think, and we can sometimes find ourselves prioritising rights over equalities and so on and so forth. And when that happens, of course, then we want to remember that we're not there to just kind of break the rules willy-nilly to kind of unbalance this system, but that what we want to do is to make sure that the other bits of the system that were so hard fought for are enabled to come back into play. We have these democracies that allow us now to make our political systems better, more democratic. We don't need to always break the rules to do that.
Nadine.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. So what happens if rules do not protect everyone in the society? What if rules are there as a means of the powerful in a state to suppress minorities? Should we then kind of abolish them altogether, and with it, those who enforce them. So today marks 3 years since George Floyd died, and some of you might have heard of him. He was the African American who was killed by a police officer who kneeled on his back, and as a result, Floyd died and suffocated. His death triggered a wave of protests, not only in America, but really all across the world, because we find police brutality and racial discrimination like pretty much everywhere, everywhere over the world. So be it in the UK, in France, in Germany, really everywhere. And one of the demands that were made as a result of the death and a result of the protest was to defund and abolish the police. And this might be like one very reasonable demand when we look at, okay, the system is broken, it doesn't work anymore, it doesn't work for everyone in the society. So it has to kind of be an option on the table to actually abolish the police as well. And I don't want to just look at the historical context as Iain did, but also at the geographical context. So there are a lot of examples, for example, from the Global South, where police was built up from scratch, or institutions were built up from scratch, and kind of like a new system was created. And so we need to kind of like be able to discuss this as well, but discuss it with like one caveat. Something like building up from scratch or a tabula rasa actually doesn't really exist, because there are always kind of like certain societal structures, there are any kind of like people in a system that contribute to a newly built kind of like order or newly built state. So we need to acknowledge this and build this in as well.
Kuzi.
Thank you, Richard, and hello, everybody. So to answer this question, when is the time to break the rules, we need to ask more questions, such as who's setting the rules, who are the rules being made for, and to what end are these rules being made. Now, a civil rights campaign leader, Martin Luther King, made a distinction between just and unjust laws. He wrote this in a Birmingham city jail in 1963, I believe it was, barely a month before today. And one of the things that he mentioned about, just rules is that these are any kind of laws that uplift the human personality, human dignity, human morality, respect for general human beings. And these were laws that are made with that in mind. He was also a religious leader, and biblically, the Bible distinguishes as well between the compliance to the law, the letter of the law, versus the spirit of the law. And so in thinking about unjust laws, the way that Martin Luther King distinguished between these were anything that violate human dignity, i.e. the spirit of the law itself or the interpretation of it. And so when we think about this, and we think about things like segregation that Martin Luther King was writing to at that particular time, where there were laws in place that would divide groups of people, different cultural groups, racial groups, and there was that segregation that would happen. These were what he defined as unjust laws. And it is these laws that should be broken.
Thanks, Kuzi. Ben.
Thanks, Richard, and thanks everyone for coming along today. So something that's kind of been mentioned by my colleagues so far is this word, the law, right? We're talking about when is it okay to break the rules, but in some ways, what we mean by rules is a lot messier by this simple distinction between something that's a law and something that's not. When we're talking about breaking rules, I think the implication behind our discussion today is we want to change something, right? We're breaking the law because we want to make some kind of change to our democracy or to unjust laws. But actually, it's a bit fuzzier than that sometimes. So we might want to distinguish between rules that are laws and rules which are just social conventions, things which we kind of follow, things we think other people should follow, things that we think other people shouldn't do, but they're not strictly laws. You're not going to get punished for breaking those rules, but there might be other kinds of consequences. So if we want to make a change, we also have this distinction to keep in mind that, okay, we might have to break certain laws to make a change, to show them to be wrong, But actually, it's not just laws, but also social conventions that can be just as much a problem or a barrier to change. So a lot of the things I've talked about cross over with this moral impermissibility, that you shouldn't make other people's lives more difficult by, say, striking because you're a train driver. But actually, we have to engage with this moral dimension, not just when it comes to the law, but also when we think about what people think a good life look like, or what people should do to be a good person to their fellow citizens. I'm not going to give you any answers to these questions, but I think they make thinking about changing and breaking the rules a lot more messier and complex than we sometimes think they are when we talk about it just in terms of the law.
Great, thanks, Ben. I'm going to ask for a quick one-worder from everybody on the panel. Is politics politics without breaking the rules? Iain?
No. I mean, I think we do need to understand that what we take to be the political domain, and let's just say partly that's kind of dominated these days by the kind of democratic systems of government that we think about, not exclusively, of course. Those have been forged out of rule breaking, but that doesn't mean that we need to be encouraging the rule breaking. We need to see. Yep.
Understood. Kuzi, can you do it on any yes or no for politics?
No.
No. Very categorical. Nadine?
No.
No? Ben?
It can be.
Ah, the middle ground. The middle ground. That's great. Well, thank you very much for all of our panellists. And we look forward to hearing what our audience think about our take on breaking the rules. Welcome back to Kent Talks, where we're answering the question, when is it time to break the rules? So let's start off with some questions from our audience.
Hi, my name is Tia, and my question is, what do you think about the Stephen Lawrence situation and police brutality?
So when I see police brutality, I think we have to kind of, take an even deeper look and say, what are the institutions that allow that to continue? So if we've seen this in the United States, we've seen this, in Britain, we even see this in many parts of Africa as well, to varying degrees and different degrees. So I think there are some fundamental questions that we have to ask ourselves and each other about what those overriding principles are that guide our institutions, and how this then begins to be reproduced, what then needs to be interrupted in the way that our institutions are designed for us to actually be able to no longer have the casualties that we've been seeing on a mass scale.
My name's Asher, and I'm asking, why did it take such a huge incident as the death of George Floyd to cause a movement on the mistreatment of ethnic minorities?
So what we know from kind of like any kind of political movements and protest movements is that it really comes in waves. So there are like certain events or certain elements that trigger this. So we had kind of like movements obviously in the 1960s, 70s, 80s. But what makes this incident in particular really interesting and is somewhat different to the like really older decades before is the role of social media and the role of smartphones as well. So it was really one of the first time that something like this was caught on a smartphone through social media. It was spreaded really all across the world. So everyone beyond the US, also in the UK and Germany and France and so on, could see what was happening, and the brutality of this event really made people shocked and mobilized with all their kind of protests. And especially kind of like in terms of mobilizing protests, obviously it's now much easier to kind of organize, to kind of say, okay, we organize a protest tomorrow, like at this and that place, and it is really easy to kind of reach so many different people. So this is kind of one of the reasons I would say why this caused such a movement at this particular moment in time. But obviously it is always kind of like a certain window of opportunity that needs to be there as well.
Thanks, Nadine. Kuzi.
Yes, and I think I would certainly agree with everything that's been said by Nadine. I think Ethnic minorities, especially in the United States. We know about the incarceration that has been ongoing, especially when it comes to black males, and that has been ongoing in the background for many, many, many years. Systematic racism, things like that are very much institutionalized, in the society, in the law, in the structures that themselves are unjust. And I think this has always been something that has been going on in the backdrop, but I think the George Floyd situation was a stark reminder of the existence of that. And I think, just as Nadine has said, the social media is something that then sort of highlighted something that was always in the background and looming very much in the background to the public eye. The dissemination of information all over the world in an instant, and the footage, which was really glaring, and a glaring reminder of the discrimination against ethnic minorities in the US and more globally as well.
Hello, my name is Brian Jake Cleaker of the Morning School, and my question is, considering the recent spate of controversial protest methods by environmental groups such as Just Stop Oil, Extinction Rebellion and Insulate Britain, do you think that the current methods of protest being utilised by these groups outweigh the rationale behind said protests?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. This raises a lot of important questions, of course, when we think about the kind of the nature of our democracies, how we keep them vibrant. It's really important that we have all the kind of avenues of civil disobedience available to us if, that is, the public sphere has not done its job. The public sphere is kind of hard-baked into our liberal democracies. It's the kind of coffee shops, it's the newspapers, it's the early print media, as it was at the time, that would engage and enable discussion and debate to make sure precisely that our private interests and our public goods were kind of brought into conversation together so that we could move things along, keep them live, keep them active, and keep them in tune with our changing times. And, the tail end of your question, you mentioned the kind of rationale behind such protests. Well, actually, I think reason really sits in the public sphere. We should be able to reasonably debate with each other about hugely significant things, including, of course, our response to the environment. If that public sphere stops to function properly, then, of course, we have a long history of civil disobedience stepping in to kickstart it again, to help us get past the impasse.
Thanks, Iain. Ben?
Thanks, Richard, and thanks for your question, Brian. So I'm going to take a slightly different tack to Iain's big structural systemic answer, right? Because really your question is about the difference between means and ends. How can we say these means are adequate for pursuing this end or this goal? It's a big question, right? It's one of the biggest questions in political philosophy and philosophy. So I want to throw a couple of thoughts your way, right? I don't want to give a strict answer. But one of the arguments that tends to be given to a lot of these kinds of protests is something like inconvenience, right? That you made it harder for me to get to work, right? Or, it's I can't fill up my car when I need to, or that's the cheaper petrol station, to use another example that's come from the questions. I think a lot of weight is put on this idea of inconvenience, right? The people getting irate because they can't go about their day in a easy or simple or unhindered way. Now, I don't know that that's a strong enough concept to say that these particular means aren't justified, right? That inconvenience is enough of a moral kind of problem to say you can't pursue that end through these means. So to give you a contrasting example, violence is the typical thing which we say those means are never justified. And people have made arguments, in fact, that it can be justified, but just for argument's sake. So I think when we're trying to answer this question, do those methods actually kind of render those ends kind of illegitimate, or are those means kind of basically turning people away? We have to think about, okay, well, actually, why is that a problem, right? Why is it a problem that someone threw powder on the snooker table? In the grand scheme of things, I'm kind of ambivalent about snooker either way, right? In the grand scheme of things, it's not a huge problem, right? So I think that's the thing we have to think about, is what are the kind of criteria we're trying to say, but is that means really justified? And how serious and significant is that? So that's the first kind of thing to chew on, I think, right? What kind of real moral claims are we making about whether this thing is right or wrong? The second then, as another way to think about this, is, well, whose interest is it pursuing? I think, and I don't speak as a member of any of these movements, but I think the kind of general claim being made is that it's in the general interest. It's the interest of everyone, right? And that these kinds of means are being used against particular interests, right? That actually we can't substitute the interest of all of humanity for the particular interests of other individuals or a particular subset of those individuals, right? And so I think this comes back to this convenience question, because we often say, well, these means aren't justified because it makes our lives more difficult, it makes it a bit more inconvenient. That's a difficult line to take when you're talking to climate migrants who are already growing in numbers and will continue to grow in numbers. So whose interest is it in favour of, I think, is a question to ask when you're trying to wriggle around this difficult problem. And what kind of criteria you're trying to apply.
Hello, my name's Elizabeth. My question is, how do you feel about the historical figures being torn down as they do not fit with today's standards?
So thanks for that question, Elizabeth. I think I would have to bring positionality into the center of this question, because your question was, how do we feel about historical figures being taken down as they do not fit with today's standards? And whatever today's standards are going to be defined on where in the world you're sitting, who you are, what the historical trajectory of where you are is. Okay, so if we're sitting, for instance, in hot Johannesburg in South Africa, and we're in the middle of the, Rhodes statue must fall, obviously this question will have different implications if we're sitting there under Nelson Mandela's Rainbow Nation, where a lot of the wealth of the country is tied up in the hands of a white minority, okay? And you've got sort of a growing, frustrated black majority. So when you see, the symbol of colonialism really being depicted by the statue of Rhodes, and this movement that actually Rhodes has to come down, because this is symbolic of this injustice, or this sort of colonial domination that has loomed over these kind of countries and institutions, the education, the wealth system, the economics, the political system, then yes, you would be sitting and you'd be thinking that those statues have to come down. But if you're sitting somewhere else, okay, and you're honoring freedom fighters who maybe have fought in a particular struggle for independence, you might have different opinions about that. So I think it's just to sort of say, I think the only way, there's no hard and fast answers to this. It really depends on where in the world you're sitting and what your positionality is.
Thanks, Kuzi. Iain.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I think this is really about who we collectively think we are, and that one of the things that is so central to our democratic institutions is that we collectively are allowed to change our minds about who we think we are. Underneath that, I think, is a really interesting notion. It's the concept of recognition. The idea that we can know who we are ourselves, but only if other people will also know us the way we know ourselves. And that kind of sense of needing other people to affirm who we are is, I think, crucial to this whole issue. Because when you're faced with a statue that does not speak back to you, so to say, with who we think we are collectively, then I can understand why it needs to come down. Of course, the positionality that Kuzi's been talking about is global. It's also national and local, because, of course, there is no simple sense that in which we all think of ourselves in the same way. We are, in fact, arguably increasingly divided about who we think we collectively are. In that sense, just as Kuzi was suggesting, I think we need to bring these issues and debates into the public sphere so that we can debate them and figure out who we think we are.
That's all we have time for. Thank you to our panel of experts, our audience, and to you for watching.
What did you learn today? Have your opinions changed on anything?
Well, I've definitely have gained a larger insight into the issue regarding the environmental protests.
I think if the rules are unjust, but again, that is so subjective because different people are going to think different rules are unjust.
I think it's like when there is no other option and you have to make sure that it's not actually creating more problems and harm to anyone else.
Really, it's interesting because we don't exactly tackle all of these matters in modules, so it's like a big union of problems and issues that obviously concerns everyone from different angles, from professors and so on.
Yeah, it definitely broadened the kind of ideas surrounding protests and how I kind of think about how if protest is justified, the means to an end and why people protest, and if people's kind of becoming angry about protest, if that's justified and why they might become angry and whether that necessarily means that people shouldn't engage in protest.